So we're going to transition now from mitigation, getting people into and out of and surviving on campus and in the classroom, to actually what goes on in the classroom. And so for that, I'd like to turn it to my colleague, Mona Sloane, who, as we heard earlier, is a sociologist at NYU, focused on inequality and ethics, but she's also actively building the NYU Alliance for Public Interest Technology, which is a critical cross-university collection of faculty that are doing phenomenal work. So with that, Mona, please introduce your panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just making sure I have all my panelists, and I do. Wonderful to see you all. If you could switch on your camera, please. And thank you, Andy, again for the introduction. Thank you to my panelists. It's my absolute pleasure to host this conversation, because I'm also a very passionate educator at New York University at the Tandon School of Engineering, and I am very keen on this conversation that we're going to be having today on the challenges of the pandemic and the classroom. So I'm just going to do a quick round of introductions and then delve right in. I am delighted to welcome to the panel Nelson James, who is a rising senior in the Technology, Culture, and Society Department at NYU Tandon, which is the engineering school. He's pursuing a BS in Science and Technology Studies and an MS in Integrated Digital Media. His current research focuses on looking into the technological future of education and its implications on K-12 students. Now, in addition to his studies, Nelson does a whole bunch of things. He works at Ottmar Hall as a resident assistant. He is at NYU Wagner as an instructional designer intern. He's at the GovLab as a research intern, and at Scholar STEM as a course developer and coding instructor. It is also my pleasure to welcome Maura Conley, who has recently accepted a position as learning designer at Pratt Institute's Center for Teaching and Learning after more than a decade as an adjunct assistant professor in the Humanities and Media Studies and Intensive English programs with a degree in both English and Education and an MFA in Creative Writing. Maura has recently continued on with work in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies PhD program at Stony Brook University. Then, absolute pleasure to also welcome Chris Gilliard, who is a prolific writer, professor, and speaker. His scholarship concentrates on digital privacy and the intersections of race, class, and technology. He's an advocate for critical and equity-focused approaches to tech in education. His work has been featured in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, EDUCAUSE Review, Fast Company, Vice, and Real Life magazine, and he's also very active on Twitter. And then lastly, my NYU colleague, Kevin Gotkin, who is a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at NYU. He received his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania in 2018 and has been teaching at the college level since 2012. He is also the artist in remote residence at the Critical Design Lab led by Amy Hamre, who's a wonderful accessibility activist and scholar. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. I want to start with a really simple question for everybody, which is, what's your most prominent, relevant, disturbing, joyful experience with education going remote? And we've been talking about students so much, Nelson, and so I'm going to hand over to you first and ask you that question. As a student, but also as an instructor, what has been your most prominent experience?
Yeah, thank you all for having me. But I think one of the most things that has been prevalent in all of my experiences, both as a student and also instructor, is actually my mom. She loves to sing. And, you know, whenever I'm in a class or I'm teaching a recitation session, it'll just be some random moment where she starts singing. And, you know, it really is a funny moment, not only for the students, but also for the professors that has had to endure my mom's terrible voice. So it's something that, you know, it's becoming a part of the experience, especially with my recitation session. They're always expecting her to come and do some type of song. So it's one of those really funny things that I'm sure everyone has had some experience of.
Thanks so much for sharing that. Wonderful. I've noticed. Thank you, Nelson, for that. Maura, could you sort of take that as a cue and respond to that prompt from an educator perspective?
Yeah, so I think the instance I want to highlight is more as in my role as a learning designer at the Center for Teaching and Learning. We hosted coffee meets 3 times a week after the exit from campus in spring. We were trying to hold our faculty in a way that we were reimagining on the daily. And someone came, there was no agenda, it was very loose, and someone came and said, I just spoke to a colleague. They were distraught, and they were like, I just spoke to a colleague who said one of their major successes from the day before was hosting a 6-hour studio class on Zoom. And we were like, it was both illuminating and disturbing that people were really in spring trying to find the direct translation project of classroom practice and online practice. And I think what we kept butting up against was that it's not, and our faculty weren't fully held in that, right? Like they didn't know what to do if somebody was touting 6-hour Zoom classes as a victory, while someone else was like, I just feel like it's not right. There was really no space for figuring it out. And so it was an interesting thing to keep unpacking with faculty throughout the semester. So it was illuminating, not as joyous as Nelson's anecdote, but a reality of our faculty nonetheless.
Thank you for that. And I remember those days of the long calls. I also remember being absolutely excited when I was in a Zoom call with 60 colleagues, you know, the first few days of the pandemic, to see everybody. And now the Zoom wall is a whole different experience. Kevin, I want to turn to you and against the backdrop of also your experience as an educator, but also as somebody who thinks very actively and does activism in the accessibility and disability studies space. What's your most prominent experience with that topic?
Yeah, hi everyone. If you don't have my audio or I need to speak up, just let me know. Yeah, so as you said, Mona, I come to this conversation as a scholar of disability, a disability organizer, an activist, and as a teacher that tries to teach in an anti-ableist way. So I think there was a kind of relief and also bemusement that a lot of us with chronic illness, students, faculty who identify as disabled, we experienced like, suddenly we can be quite oriented toward accessibility if we want to, right? My students, although I try to teach in an anti-ableist way, there's a culture of ableism in our classrooms, right? That will sometimes make disability or just getting in touch with one's access needs in any way, you know, somehow like, you know, in competition with academic excellence. So what I experienced, you know, since we moved to online instruction is that we're able to kind of trust each other and talk about what we need to get access to. And in my teaching, we really think about the features of our, you know, new communication platforms. And so thinking about things like, what do transcripts and live captions do for us as learners remotely now? You know, normally a thing that you would have to maybe go through a lot of rigmarole in order to get captions in a classroom as, you know, an ADA accommodation, suddenly are now being, you know, offered to us as inputs that we can all use to design learning environments that work for us. So I think the kind of, it's a collection of moments for me when my students really were able to talk about their access needs in ways that freed up all of these new kind of possibilities for what we do in class.
Thank you for that, Kevin. It's wonderful to hear that. And I've been following some of these conversations, and I do have sort of a follow-up thought slash question that we can address later. Chris, you've been writing about sort of student surveillance and issues around inequity, technology, and education. And so I do wonder if you could give us your thoughts on that topic and what's your experience with this whole new situation that we find ourselves in, where we're forced into this kind of surveillance state of teaching, as it were.
Thank you. Yeah, the thing that stood out most to me is I had a student who I'd had in a previous class, who was one of my best students. But as we went into lockdown and to online only, I noticed that the student really wasn't participating and kind of sort of disappeared, or turned in most of their work late and things like that, if they turned it in at all. And a couple weeks in, the student let me know that they only had internet access on the weekends. And I was really happy is not the right word exactly, but I was glad that the student felt the ability, felt okay sharing that with me, because there is unfortunately a real stigma attached to that a lot of times. But it just reminded me so much that, the questions about technology and access and how important those are, and that, lots of students don't, I think, feel safe telling instructors that. And, I always try to keep that in the forefront of my mind as we kind of do things the way we're doing them now.
Thanks for that, Chris. I want to follow up on that and sort of turning to Nelson again on that cue, and I want to steer us a bit more decidedly towards the topic of equity, which is a current that we want to run through this whole event. Nelson, what is it like on the student side, the transition? How have the sort of relation, or maybe your relationships, if you would want to share that, to your professors changed, and also to your peers? In what way do you guys interact with each other inside the classroom and outside of the classroom? And how would you, or could you relate that to issues around equity, including accessibility or access?
Yeah, definitely. I would have to say the transition for me, at least, it was very fluid, mostly because I actually attended Brown Virtual School for 3 years of high school. So I was very familiar with like the virtual format, even though that particular virtual school, everything was asynchronous. So I was able to see how online education can be done really well in a very good format, rather than, some of my experiences with the professors I had that, tried this copy and paste format of like doing exactly what you did in the in-person setting and an online setting. So it was very frustrating to see that, but I also understood that no one asked for this. But one thing that was really helpful was that the professors were very accommodating. They had a lot of empathy and understanding that, this situation can be very different for everyone. I remember some of my friends, they don't have access to technology at home, so they couldn't actually attend synchronous sessions or participate as they normally would in person. So it was very interesting, but mostly I think the one thing that was very constant and the one thing that was really helpful was this idea of like empathy, and having that as a professor, both on like the instruction side and also on the student side, being empathetic that, professors might not know how to use Zoom or share that screen, and being able to kind of work with each other to develop something that is, personal and new in this new format of remote learning.
Thanks for that, Nelson. I'm going to use that as a cue for Maura and ask specifically, in your experience at Pratt and sort of teaching all these, humanities and sort of the arts and sort of focus on studio and all of these things, and you just alluded to that. A word we hear a lot as educators these days is what Nelson said, asynchronous teaching elements. And so these are very important to provide access also for students who may be in different time zones or can't access the synchronous sessions and so on. And so I wonder, what is your experience and what are your experiences and thoughts on the asynchronous element, which has become so central for making this work?
Yeah, I think Nelson brings up a good point. The asynchronous is really where you see the ability of all students to jump into the curriculum in a really engaged way. I think there needs to be more focus on that as we regroup and sort of rethink our fall semester. Especially Pratt just announced that they're not reopening the dorms, and it really disallows some people who were imagining what coming back to campus would look like and free up for them in terms of like reliable internet, and that's just all going to be reimagined, and different time zones, right? And I think we're going to lean heavily on our Learning Access Center to help us think through all of the ways that we make our synchronous portions asynchronous, right? So if it's the translation project of in-person, face-to-face teaching, now to online teaching, it is additionally, and I think this is something that came up in the previous session with Barry and Camilla, focusing on like all of the things that existed, right, before COVID or pre-pandemic are heightened and sort of layered. And so now it's the translation project of a mix of synchronous and asynchronous to now really a focus on the equity and accessibility of asynchronous pretty exclusively, I would say.
Thanks for that. And also thanks for acknowledging that there's sort of a whole, transition happening that we're all, participate in, we're all learning. At the same time, Nelson has said something along those lines as well. So Kevin, my sort of question for you would be, in order to, again, make things work, we're seeing a lot of investment into technology. We're seeing a lot of investment into classroom tech, some of that in the spirit of being able to provide blended teaching experiences or hybrid teaching for universities. And so as a disability scholar and activist, could you maybe give us your thoughts on how tech innovation coming out of the disability community has sort of facilitated issues around education and or dealing with issues around education and equity, so we can hear some success stories and maybe get some ideas of how we can make this work as we move forward?
Yeah. There's a lot of knowledge about remote collaborations and work that I think has been lodged in disability culture long before this moment, because those of us with chronic illnesses, we can't always promise that we will actually be able to get to the events, right? And so really working together has meant that we've been doing work in remote space and using platforms like Zoom for a long time in a really distributed way that allows for a kind of disability cultural collaboration across time and space. So I think in disability culture we also know that tech is one of the circuits that we need for like collective governance and for decision making that is informed by the folks who have the most knowledge about the systems that we are adapting. Even just to take it as an example, I think it looks like we're using automated captions for this session, right? One of the things that we do in my class is think about the automation of captioning and thinking about the political economy of that workforce. There's captioners, stenographers who are humans who do this work for a living. And so when we really think, critically about how we can center and honor disability knowledge in the decisions we're making about how classrooms operate, we really get down to the level of what kind of captions, what kind of transcript, who should be doing the work, how do we cultivate the classroom space together in ways that lead us to a whole bunch of forms of engagement. Actually, I think when I teach us to be critical about these kinds of new classroom experiences, students suddenly are like reading the terms of service between NYU and Zoom, and actually like following up with administrators saying, hey, I'm wondering about where these transcripts live, right? Like things like that actually feed us back into some general principles about disability organizing and accountability and shared governance that are kind of that are kind of outside of the solely technological realm.
Thanks for that, Kevin. I'm delighted to hear that your students are doing that now as part of also building literacy around socio-technical systems. Our closed captions are actually manual today. So I just want to, I'm delighted that we have them. And I do appreciate the example, and I use similar sort of examples in my own teaching as well. Chris, I want to push you a little bit on questions and issues around infrastructures, socio-technical infrastructures that we are building, that we're building at speed and scale now within universities, to be able to teach remotely and to provide the classroom experience, and issues around privacy, surveillance, oppression, inequity. Questions that have been long debated in STS, feminist STS, in critical race studies, and so on. And hear your thoughts on that. What should we be mindful of?
Oh, wow. Well, I'll try to give a brief answer. I mean, one of the things I would point to is perhaps people have seen the numerous articles and discussions about workplace surveillance, and how the working from home has accelerated a lot of the surveillance in people's homes that typically they experienced at work. And I think a lot of this stuff is very, a lot of these systems and technologies and platforms, make a lot of promises about what they're able to do if we just supply them with student data. And in a lot of times I understand that's very attractive, but I think there's always potential harms. And sometimes they're not potential. I mean, they're very present and exist. And so just like, for instance, everyone notices that I don't have my camera on, and so I've seen a lot of discussions about, say, forcing students to have their camera on during sessions and things like that. And I would just encourage people, I mean, I don't think saying anything new to people here, but I would encourage people to think about what the sort of allowances and affordances and risks and things like that are when they make those decisions. So what potentially may a student be revealing if they're forced, that they don't want to reveal and shouldn't be required to reveal, if they're forced to have their camera on? What kinds of, there's been stories, there's a story in Consumer Reports today about how the College Board is feeding information to Google and Facebook. And, there's a story the other day about people who were taking the bar who had to use Proctor services that did eye tracking, which is like super ableist and problematic. And so I don't want to take up too much time, but these are kind of the things that run through my mind when we think about this stuff.
Thanks for that, Chris. And I think it's very important to underscore that there are issues around normalizing surveillance in that way that we need to be mindful of. And as educators, one of the things as an educator, one of the things I'm hopeful for is that we can build literacy around these issues across the board, not just, in engineering schools or maybe in STS programs or so on, but for everybody. So I want to flag that the Q&A is open. You can post your question in the Q&A chat if you want. Meanwhile, I will take the last round and start again with Nelson. What are you hopeful for as a student, as somebody who might or hopefully will become a leader in the education sector? What's your biggest hope as we sort of walk through this portal of the pandemic as Arundhati Roy has framed it?
Yeah, I think more specifically, this is a time to really think about the individual, the individual students' learning and their ability to engage with the content. More specifically, because when you have students that's coming from different circumstances and situations, they might not be able to engage in that synchronous session. But as a teacher, as an educator, you can actually work with that student to develop something that might be specific for them. So I think it's a time to really thinking about how we can personalize education for individual students, especially within the K through 12 space. For me as a student who's done work in instructional design and is working with professors and help them think about how how do they diversify their curriculum to be more adaptable and more resilient towards situations that might occur. I think it's really important to have empathy and flexibility because, you know, as situations and circumstances change, there are things that might be different. But I think flexibility and empathy is really key for especially this, you know, semester that we're going to come into.
Thanks for that, Nelson. I really appreciate it. Maura, same question.
I think I would double down on that compassion note. I think this is an opportunity, if one hasn't examined one's teaching, to be an action of empathy and compassion and flexibility. That now is the time, and there really is no other way around but through. And so if, you know, I think we have like seasoned veteran teachers who really have the opportunity to open up to like universal design principles and asynchronous portions of their class. And I think professors now more than ever are really open to it. And so that makes me hopeful.
I share that. Thank you, Maura. Kevin, your hope, your one hope.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that we are allowing disability culture to lead the revolution. I think a lot of us kind of knew that the revolution would start in bed. You know what I mean? Like not just in the streets, very active movement, but that actually slowness and rest and caring for our bodies is kind of revolutionary. So you know, I'm hopeful that that brings us to much broader ideas about accountability and governance and moving beyond a kind of framework of risk and accommodation as we reopen campuses, but really thinking collectively about every single member of our community. So I just want to, before I leave, I'm just going to drop a link into the chat from a group known as the Accessible Campus Action Alliance that has really modeled what this can look like, how to put disability at the center of campus reopenings in an equitable way. I'm really hopeful that that kind of thing will help us reimagine our spaces of learning.
Thanks for that, Kevin. Really appreciate it. And especially the notion around care and caring for each other and maintenance. Chris, what is your one hope?
Well, I really just mirror everything everyone else has said. You know, I don't know if there's a thing as trickling down, but I think that lots of us have been having these conversations, and in some cases, you know, sort of screaming from the rooftops. You know, it's very unfortunate that it has taken, you know, a global pandemic for people to pay attention to that. But I think in this, and I don't like the word opportunity, but I think it is a chance now for people to re-examine a lot of things that a lot of folks have been talking about for a long time and trying to get done. And so I'm really hopeful and optimistic that these things are happening right now.
Thank you. I think that is a wonderful note to close this terrific panel. My sincere thanks to Nelson James, Maura Conley, Kevin Gotkin, Chris Gilliard for your wonderful insights and this brief conversation. I'm sure we could talk forever about this. I surely would love to do that. Your insight has been tremendous and very helpful, very important cues for taking this further. Thanks so much. I'm gonna hand back to Andy, who's gonna introduce the next panel. Thank you, everybody.